My mother-in-law humiliated me at the family dinner. She said, "Sit with the kids and play with them. You are a poor factory worker and have no place at the table." I was furious and left without a word. What happened next shocked everyone. Let me quickly thank you for your continuous support. This means a lot to us. If you enjoy the stories we share, kindly subscribe to this channel. It will be great if you can leave a comment on which city you are watching from. We might just give you a shout-out in our next story. Today's special shout-out goes to John Gary from Miami. We are glad you enjoy our stories. Now let's go deeper into the story. I had always been the quiet one at family dinners, the man who worked long hours at the factory, who came home smelling of machine oil and sweat. Emma, my wife, liked to say it was my dedication that made her fall for me in the first place. I'd never minded the way her parents looked at me, like I was the hired help rather than the man who put food on the table. But that night, something in me snapped. The dining room was set the way it always was when Emma's parents hosted dinner. The good china gleamed under the harsh overhead light, and the long wooden table was crowded with dishes that smelled of garlic and rosemary. My mother-in-law, June, was fussing over the roast, her thin lips turned down in concentration. She was a small woman, with sharp features and a sharper tongue. A woman who never missed a chance to remind me of my place in her world. We all sat down, Emma next to me, her hand resting lightly on my forearm. Her father, Douglas, cleared his throat, murmuring about the weather and the price of gas. I sat there in my work clothes, feeling out of place among the crisp dress shirts and shiny earrings. I told myself it didn't matter, that I'd worked 16 hours this week, that I was the one who paid the mortgage on this very house they lived in. But June's voice cut through my thoughts. "Ethan," she said, her tone sweet and cold at the same time, "why don't you go sit with the children? You're so good with them. And honestly, a factory worker like you doesn't really belong at the table tonight, does he?" The words were casual, almost playful, but the smirk on her lips told me it was no joke. My face flushed hot, and I could feel Emma's hand tighten on my arm. The kids at the smaller table turned to look at me with wide eyes, and for a moment, the entire room fell silent, like the air had been sucked out of it. I swallowed hard, the bitter taste of shame rising in my throat. I wanted to speak, to call her out, but the words caught in my mouth. My whole life, I've been taught to swallow my pride, to keep the peace. But in that moment, I couldn't. My hands trembled under the table, fists tightening in my lap. Emma tried to laugh it off. "Mom, don't be ridiculous. Ethan's worked hard all day. He deserves to sit with us." June's eyes met mine, cold and hard. "Oh, I'm sure he's worked hard, scrubbing oil off his hands and sweating over machines. But this is a family dinner, dear. He'll be more comfortable with the children." The words were a slap. I felt them echo in my chest, each syllable pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. I pushed back my chair, the scrape of the legs on the tile loud in the stunned silence. Without a word, I stood and left the room. I could hear Emma calling my name, but I didn't look back. I walked out of the dining room, down the narrow hall, and out the front door into the cool night air. The sky was streaked with the last light of dusk, and the world felt suddenly vast and empty. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. I'd spent years letting them walk all over me, years of biting my tongue and telling myself it didn't matter. But tonight, it did. As I walked down the cracked sidewalk, the air smelled of rain and cut grass. My heart pounded with a mix of anger and something else, relief, maybe, or the first taste of freedom. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay in that house another minute. Not after what she said. Not after the way she looked at me. I thought about the mortgage I paid, the bills I covered, the repairs I made. I thought about how they never thanked me, how they treated me like a child playing dress-up. And I thought about Emma, the way she tried to laugh it off, like her mother's words were nothing. I knew I'd reached my limit. By the time I got to the end of the block, my phone buzzed in my pocket. Emma's name lit up the screen. I stared at it, my thumb hovering over the button to answer. But I couldn't. Not tonight. I turned off the phone and kept walking, the weight of her mother's words still pressing on my chest. In that moment, I realized something. I'd been trying to keep the peace for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up for myself. That night, I promised myself it would never happen again. I didn't go far that night, just walked the neighborhood in circles until the moon was high and my legs ached. The street lamps cast long shadows on the cracked pavement, and every footstep echoed in my ears. I thought about going to a friend's place or maybe checking into a motel, but the truth was I didn't want to see anyone. I needed space to let the fury settle, space to sort through the storm of thoughts that kept clashing in my head. June's words replayed over and over, like a recording I couldn't shut off. You are a poor factory worker and have no place at the table. My throat burned as I replayed it. I thought about all the dinners I'd sat through, the polite conversations I'd forced myself to join, even when I knew she saw me as nothing more than a burden. I'd let her snide remarks pass too many times, hoping that if I was patient enough, she'd come around. But that night proved she never would. I remembered how Emma had tried to smooth it over, telling her mother to stop, but I also remembered the way she'd laughed nervously, like it was just a harmless joke. My wife had always been the peacemaker, quick to excuse her family's behavior, quick to ask me to let it go. But I couldn't anymore. I felt like a fool for how long I'd let it slide. By the time I made my way back home, the house was dark. I let myself in quietly, the weight of exhaustion settling into my bones. I could hear voices from the living room, Emma's hushed tones, June's sharp whisper, but I didn't care enough to listen. I went straight to our bedroom, shutting the door behind me like it was a wall between me and the rest of them. I sat on the edge of the bed, my work boots still on, staring at the floor. My fists were still clenched, and my knuckles were white. I thought about how many times I'd done the right thing, how many times I'd swallowed my pride for the sake of family. I thought about the mortgage statement that came every month with my name at the top and how her parents had never paid a cent in rent or bills. The longer I sat there, the clearer it became. This was the end of me bending over backward to make them comfortable. Emma cracked the door open at some point, her face pale in the dim light. "Ethan," she said softly, "can we talk?" I didn't look at her. "Not tonight, Emma," I said, my voice low and steady. "I'm too angry, and I don't want to say something I can't take back." She stepped inside, closing the door behind her. "She didn't mean it, you know. Mom just says stupid things sometimes. Don't," I cut her off, finally looking up. "Don't tell me she didn't mean it. She's been saying stupid things for years. And you've always expected me to let it slide." Emma's eyes glistened with tears. "She's my mother. I'm trying to keep the peace." "And I'm your husband," I shot back, my voice rising despite myself. "I'm the one paying the bills for this house. I'm the one who's been working my ass off so your parents don't have to." And she humiliated me tonight in front of everyone, like I was a child who didn't belong. Emma reached out for me, but I pulled back. I couldn't stand the thought of her touching me right then, not when the echo of her mother's words still rang in my ears. "I'll sleep in the guest room," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. She turned and left, and I was grateful for the silence that followed. That night, I lay awake in the dark, staring at the ceiling. The decision formed in my mind with the same clarity I felt when I walked out of that dinner. I wasn't going to let them treat me like this anymore. I'd been generous to a fault, and all it had gotten me was scorn. By the time the first light of dawn crept in through the curtains, I was sure of what I had to do. I'd cancel the payments. I'd send them packing. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming my dignity. I felt strangely calm, like the fury that had been roaring in my chest all night had finally burned itself out. I rose from the bed, my bones aching but my mind clear. As I dressed for the day, I thought about how I'd always believed family meant putting up with everything, swallowing every insult, shouldering every burden. But that wasn't family. Family was supposed to be respect and support, not this constant game of belittling me to make themselves feel bigger. I took a long look at myself in the bathroom mirror, the man staring back at me with tired eyes and a tight jaw. I'd never been a fighter, but this wasn't about fists or shouting matches. This was about finally saying enough. As I stepped out into the quiet morning, I felt the first real sense of peace I'd known in a long time. My mother-in-law might have thought I was a poor factory worker with no place at her table, but she didn't know I owned the table and the house that held it. She didn't know I'd spent years paying for her comfort, her dinners, her snide remarks. But she was about to find out. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the kind of day that should have felt hopeful, but to me, it felt like the start of a reckoning. I woke early, my mind buzzing with a restless energy I hadn't felt in years. Emma was still asleep in the guest room. She hadn't come back to our bed during the night, and I hadn't expected her to. There was a quiet finality to that, like a chapter closing before my eyes. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where June had looked down on me the night before, and I opened my laptop. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment, and I took a deep breath. This was the moment everything would change. I could feel it thrumming in my veins. I logged into the property management account I'd set up years ago when I'd first decided to let Emma's parents live in this house rent-free. Back then, I'd done it out of love. Out of some misguided sense of obligation to Emma's family. I'd thought that if I just gave enough, they'd come to see me as family, too. But they never had. I canceled every automatic payment linked to their utilities, the water, the gas, the electricity. One by one, I cut the ties that bound me to them, feeling a weight lift off my shoulders with every click. Then, I opened the template for the eviction notice. My fingers moved with a calm precision as I filled in the details. 3 days notice, citing non-payment, and breach of agreement. My hands didn't shake. My breathing stayed steady. I was done letting them treat me like an outsider in my own home. When I finished, I hit send and watched the confirmation message flash across the screen. It was done. No more second chances. No more humiliations. I sat back in my chair, the quiet of the kitchen pressing in around me. For a moment, I let myself feel the finality of it. The end of years of biting my tongue and pretending everything was fine. I wasn't sure what would happen next. I didn't know how Emma would react or if our marriage would survive this. But for the first time in a long time, I felt sure of myself. I made a pot of coffee and sat there in the stillness, listening to the faint hum of the refrigerator. It was almost peaceful, like the calm after a storm. Around 9, Emma finally came into the kitchen, her eyes red and puffy from crying. She stopped when she saw me, her lips parting like she was about to speak, but the words seemed to die in her throat. I held her gaze. I canceled everything, I said quietly. The payments, the utilities, and I sent them an eviction notice. Emma's mouth dropped open. You what? They have 3 days to get out, I said. I'm done, Emma. I'm done being treated like I don't matter in my own house. She shook her head, her hands trembling. You can't just do that. They're my parents, Ethan. I know, I said, and I've put up with a lot because of that. But last night was too much. I'm not going to let them humiliate me anymore. I've been paying for everything, Emma, everything. And they still treat me like I'm nothing. Her eyes filled with tears. She was just joking. You know how she is. I let out a bitter laugh. A joke? You think that was a joke? She meant every word she said. And you didn't stop her. You never do. Emma wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. Please, Ethan, don't do this. They have nowhere else to go. They'll find somewhere, I said, my voice firm. They've lived off me long enough. I'm not their safety net anymore. She sank into the chair across from me, her shoulders slumping. You're going to tear this family apart, she whispered. I looked at her for a long moment, the woman I'd loved for so many years. No, I said softly. They already did that. I'm just not going to pretend everything's fine anymore. We sat there in silence for a while, the air between us heavy with things we couldn't say. I knew this would change everything. I knew Emma would see me differently after this, and maybe she'd never forgive me. But I couldn't back down. Not this time. When she finally stood, she didn't look at me. She walked out of the kitchen, her shoulders stiff with anger and grief. I watched her go, feeling a hollow ache in my chest. I didn't want to hurt her. But I couldn't keep sacrificing myself to keep the peace. Not when the cost was my dignity. Later that day, June called. I didn't pick up. She left a voicemail, her voice dripping with fake sweetness as she asked if I was sure I meant to send the notice. She said it must be a mistake. Surely I hadn't meant to do something so drastic. I didn't respond. I didn't owe her any explanations. As the day went on, I felt a strange calm settle over me. The decision had been made. There was no going back. I didn't know what the fallout would be, but I knew this. I'd let them take advantage of me for too long, and I was done. The next few days were a blur of tension and quiet fury. I watched June and Douglas pack their things, their movements stiff with barely concealed outrage. June refused to look me in the eye, but Douglas would shoot me dark looks whenever he thought I wasn't paying attention. They were both too proud to say anything directly, but the air was thick with everything they wouldn't say out loud. Emma spent those days in a state of silent panic. She moved around the house like a ghost, pale and tense, avoiding both me and her parents. I tried to talk to her, but she shut me out. Every time I opened my mouth, she turned away, her eyes flat and cold. It hurt more than I'd expected, but I couldn't let that pain sway me. I'd made my decision, and I knew it was the right one. On the second day, June finally snapped. I was in the living room, fixing a leaky faucet I'd meant to get to for weeks, when she marched in, her face red and her hands clenched at her sides. "You think you're so much better than us, don't you?" she spat. "Just because you own this house, just because you have a steady job. You're still nothing, Ethan. You're still the boy from the factory floor, and you always will be." I wiped my hands on a rag, turning to face her. "I've never thought I was better than anyone," I said quietly. "But I won't be treated like I'm nothing anymore. Not in my own house." Her lip curled. "This isn't your house," she said, her voice shaking. "This is Emma's family's home. You're just a paycheck." I took a deep breath, feeling the fury simmer in my gut. "No," I said. "It's my house. And you're going to leave it?" She scoffed, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew I meant it. She knew there was no coming back from this. That night, Emma and I had our worst fight yet. She came to me after dinner, her eyes bright with tears. "Please, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "They're my parents. They have nowhere to go. We can find another way." I looked at her, feeling the weight of her pain, but I couldn't back down. "I'm done, Emma," I said softly. "I've done everything I can to make this work. But they don't respect me, and I can't live like this anymore." She shook her head, her shoulders trembling. "You're tearing us apart. Don't you see that?" "I'm not the one who tore us apart," I said, my voice cracking. "They did. Every time they belittled me, every time you let it slide. I can't be the only one fighting for this family anymore." She looked at me like she didn't recognize me, like I'd become a stranger overnight. "I don't know if I can forgive you for this," she whispered. I swallowed hard, feeling the words like a knife in my chest. "I know," I said. "But I can't forgive them anymore, either." By the time the eviction deadline arrived, June and Douglas had packed up everything they could carry. The moving truck pulled away in the late afternoon, the rumble of its engine echoing in my ears. Emma stood in the driveway, tears streaming down her face as she watched them leave. She didn't say a word to me, didn't even glance my way. When the truck was gone, the house felt empty in a way I couldn't quite describe. The silence was so loud it pressed on my eardrums, filling every corner of the house. I walked from room to room, the echo of my footsteps a reminder that this was my home again, mine alone. I found Emma sitting on the edge of our bed, her shoulders hunched and her face buried in her hands. I stood in the doorway, unsure what to say. My chest ached with the weight of everything we'd lost in just a few days. "I'm sorry it came to this," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. She looked up at me, her eyes swollen and red. "I don't know if I can live with what you've done," she said. "They're my parents." I nodded, feeling tears prick at my own eyes. "I know," I said, "but I have to live with what they've done to me, too." She didn't respond. She just turned away, and I knew there was nothing more to say. That night, I slept alone in our bed for the first time since we were married. The house felt too big, too quiet. I lay awake for hours, listening to the creaks and sighs of the old floorboards, trying to find some sense of peace in the aftermath. I kept telling myself I'd done the right thing, that I'd stood up for myself in a way I never had before. But in the dark, it was hard not to wonder if I'd also lost something I'd never get back. 3 days had never felt so long, yet somehow, they passed in a blur. By the final morning, the house was stripped bare of everything that didn't belong to Emma and me. June and Douglas were gone, along with their boxes of old dishes and secondhand furniture. I stood at the window that morning, watching the moving truck roll down the street, the rumble fading into a silence so complete it felt like the house was holding its breath. The front door was still ajar when I stepped outside to watch them go. The air was warm and still, heavy with the scent of cut grass and summer dust. Emma stood in the driveway, arms folded over her chest, her face pale and set. She didn't say a word as the truck disappeared around the corner, and I didn't try to break the silence. There was nothing left to say. When the truck was gone, I took a deep breath and closed the front door, the latch clicking into place with a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to Emma, but she was already walking down the hall, her back stiff and straight, shutting herself in the bedroom we used to share. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of what I'd done settle around me like a heavy coat. The rest of the day passed in a haze. I went from room to room, cleaning up the dust and stray packing tape they'd left behind. The house felt hollow, too big, too empty. My own footsteps echoed on the wooden floors, a constant reminder of just how quiet it had become. But for the first time in years, it felt like my house again. My home. That afternoon, I found Emma in the kitchen, staring out the window at the patch of overgrown garden her mother used to fuss over. She didn't look up when I came in. I poured myself a cup of coffee, the clink of the spoon against the mug loud in the stillness. "They're gone," I said quietly. She didn't answer right away, just kept staring out at the garden. When she finally spoke, her voice was small, almost childlike. "I don't know how to feel," she said. I leaned against the counter, studying her profile. "You don't have to decide today," I said. "I know this isn't easy for you." She turned to look at me then, her eyes red and tired. "You think you did the right thing," she said. It wasn't a question. I nodded. "I do." Her lips trembled. "Then I guess that's all there is to it." She walked past me, her shoulder brushing mine, and I felt the chill of her absence like a door slamming shut. I watched her go, my chest tight with a mix of regret and resolve. I hadn't wanted to hurt her, I never had. But I couldn't keep living like I didn't matter, couldn't keep being the quiet man at the edge of his own life. That evening, I sat alone in the living room, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and pink. The house was so still it felt like I was the only one alive in it. I thought about the years I'd spent trying to earn their respect, about the countless ways I'd bent myself to fit their expectations. And I thought about the way June had looked at me that last night, her face twisted in contempt, and how I'd known in that moment that I'd never earn her respect, no matter how hard I worked or how much I gave. I thought about Emma, too, about the woman I loved and the way she looked at me now, like I'd become someone she didn't recognize. It hurt in a way I didn't have words for. But underneath the hurt, there was something else, a calm certainty that I'd done what I had to do. As night fell, I walked through the empty rooms, turning off lights and locking doors. Each small ritual felt like a declaration. This is my home. This is my life. I'm not going to live in someone else's shadow anymore. When I lay down in bed that night, the sheets felt cold and foreign. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the old pipes in the walls. I told myself I'd find a way to fix things with Emma if she wanted me to. But I also knew that if she couldn't forgive me, I'd still be okay. Because for the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for someone else to tell me I mattered. I'd made my choice. And I wasn't going to look back. The days that followed were a quiet reckoning. The house felt different, lighter somehow, even though the silence pressed in around me like a constant reminder of what I'd lost. Emma moved out the next morning, her things packed into a single suitcase that she carried out to her car without a word. She wouldn't meet my eyes as she walked past me, and I didn't try to stop her. There was nothing left to say that wouldn't sound like begging or betrayal. I spent those first few days alone, relearning how to live in a space that had once felt crowded with the weight of too many expectations. I cleaned the kitchen until the counters gleamed, rearranged the living room furniture just to make it feel like mine again. I fixed the leaky faucet in the bathroom. The rhythmic drip that had always driven me crazy finally silenced. Each small task was an act of reclamation, a way to tell myself I was still here, still standing. In the evenings, I sat on the back porch, nursing a cup of coffee as the sun set behind the neighbors' trees. The sky would bloom into soft pastels, peach and lavender and dusty rose, and I'd watch the light fade, feeling the quiet settle around me like a comfort instead of a burden. My mind was loud in those moments, thoughts churning in endless loops. Emma's face when she walked out, June's voice dripping with contempt, the way my own voice had sounded so calm and final when I told them I was done. I thought about the man I used to be, the one who kept his head down, who worked himself to the bone for a family that would never see him as more than a paycheck. I thought about how many nights I'd spent lying awake, wondering if maybe I was the problem, if maybe I wasn't enough. But the truth was, I had always been enough. I just let other people make me forget it. One afternoon, I found myself in the garage, sorting through the boxes of tools and half-finished projects that had gathered dust over the years. I found an old photograph tucked into one of the boxes, Emma and me on our wedding day, her smile bright and unguarded, my arm around her waist. We looked so happy, so sure of each other. I traced my thumb over the image, feeling a pang of grief for the life we'd built and the ways we'd both let it fall apart. But even as the ache of that loss settled in my chest, I felt something else, too. Relief. For the first time in years, I wasn't living under the weight of someone else's disdain. I wasn't shrinking myself to fit into a life that didn't feel like mine. I'd made a choice to stand up for myself, and I knew, deep down, that I'd never regret that. Emma called me once, about a week after she left. Her voice was hesitant, brittle. "I'm staying with a friend," she said, and I could hear the uncertainty in her tone, like she was testing the water to see if I'd be angry or relieved. "I just need some time to think." "I understand," I said. And I did. Because I needed time, too, to figure out who I was without the constant push and pull of trying to be everything to everyone. We didn't say much else. She didn't say she wanted to come back, and I didn't ask her to. We both knew that if there was a future for us, it would have to be built on something new, something honest and equal, not the fragile truths we'd been living in. In the weeks that followed, I found a quiet kind of rhythm. I went to work at the factory, came home to an empty house, made dinner for myself. I started taking walks in the evenings, letting the sound of my own footsteps on the pavement remind me that I was still moving forward, even when it felt like everything else had come to a halt. And slowly, I began to see that this wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. The beginning of a life where I didn't have to apologize for who I was or what I wanted. The beginning of a life where I could take up space in my own home, my own heart. I thought about June sometimes, about the way her face had twisted with disgust when she told me I had no place at the table. And I realized she was right. In a way, I didn't have a place at her table. But that didn't mean I didn't have a place at my own. As the summer wore on, the house began to feel like mine again. The walls didn't echo with her judgment anymore, and the rooms didn't feel like they were holding their breath, waiting for the next cutting remark. There was peace in the emptiness, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe. One night, I stood in the doorway of the dining room, the same spot where she'd told me to sit with the children because I didn't belong. I let myself remember how small I'd felt in that moment, how her words had cut through me like a blade. But then I looked around at the quiet room, the table gleaming in the lamplight, and I realized something important. She was gone, but I was still here. I survived it, and I had claimed this space for myself. In the end, I didn't regret what I'd done. I didn't regret choosing myself. Because sometimes, standing up for yourself means losing the people who never really saw you in the first place. And sometimes, that's the only way to find the freedom to be who you truly are. I took a deep breath, feeling the weight lift off my shoulders for good. I wasn't the boy from the factory floor anymore. I was the man who owned this house, this life. And for the first time, I knew I'd never let anyone take that away from me again. If this story moved you, please consider subscribing to the channel and giving it a thumbs up. It helps more people discover these powerful family dramas. Share your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done in Ethan's shoes? Let's talk about it. Until next time, stay true to yourself and your boundaries. See you soon in the next one.